Hey friends, this is Darnell coming to you from the beautiful Bedrock Ministry studio as we march forward with America in Bible prophecy. Now we're going to dig right in here, my friends. I told you on the last lesson that we were going to be looking at the trumpets, specifically trumpets 1 through 5 as we move forward. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Let me just say before we start that there's two or three things that are very important to keep in your mind as we interpret these very important Bible prophecies, end time Bible prophecies. Number one, the trumpets differ from the seals a little bit, and even from the vials, in a couple of significant ways. The trumpets represent very specific major world changing events, okay, where the seals, the first four seals, talked about ideologies and some different things that we looked at. These are different. These are very specific world changing events. Another difference is the seals began to be opened just very shortly after John had received his revelation from Jesus. Whereas the trumpets are much more modern, what I would call modern history. The first trumpet was actually sounded just over 100 years ago. That's when the first event that we will discuss actually happened. So that's important. The third thing that I want to remind you of, and I have spoken of this before, but it's very important to keep in mind. John was getting this revelation. He was seeing these visions of more modern day world major events, but he was seeing them way back in the day that he was on the island of Patmos, far before any modern day technology at all. Important that we understand that, and it helps us to understand that the way he describes it is going to not necessarily be literal, because if you can imagine, if John, sitting on the island of Patmos some 2,000 years ago, was seeing, for example, a major war scene using today's warfare methods and instruments of warfare. Could you imagine? How would you explain, a fighter jet shooting, missiles, or a fighting helicopter, or a nuclear explosion, or any number of things that he was seeing? He would be struggling to come up with words to describe that. So that's why a lot of things, you read them and it sounds kind of fantastic, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, like flying scorpions and locusts and all these different things that he describes. You have to keep in mind that he would not have words to describe these things, but now, from where we sit, looking at the information that we have, we can make sense of it. So very specific clues given to us that I'm going to cover. Now, the first five trumpets happened in the order that the major world events happened. Trumpet 1 first, then trumpet 2, trumpet 3, 4, and 5. But I'm going to share them with you in the order that they were taught to me. And I didn't come up with all this on my own. I'm just a humble mouthpiece, really. This was revelation that was given to us by God through a great prophetic teacher in our day and age, Dr. Irvin Baxter, who I have studied for years and invested a lot of time and even money to his teachings. I would consider him my prophecy mentor, but I'm going to give them to you in a much more concise and quick way than it's taken me to get them. So he was given this interpretation by God starting at the third trumpet. And I think that it's an effective way to teach this because this trumpet is got some really unmistakable clues, and it's important that we open our heart and mind to the idea that these trumpets could have already sounded, because there's a lot of people in the religious world that have been taught by religion that everything in the book of Revelation is future. Everything in the book of Revelation is the great tribulation. Well, that couldn't be farther from the truth. And if we can really look at the clues given and understand what we're reading, it will help us to know where we are in the prophetic timeline. So, because as I said in the last teaching video, we are actually between the fifth and the sixth trumpet right now. From where we sit right now, that's where we are in time. So the sixth trumpet, we already know, I've taught you already, is the coming World War III that will start out of the area of the Euphrates. And the seventh trumpet is the marriage supper of the Lamb. So what is the fifth trumpet and the events preceding that? Well, let's go to the third trumpet. We will find it in Revelation chapter 8 and in verses 10 and 11. Two short verses, and here's what it says. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and the springs of water, and the name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. That's what we're given by John in the book of Revelation concerning this trumpet. Now, some very good clues in there, and I'm going to break them down for you. Let's look at this word wormwood. So wormwood is actually a plant used in Russia for medicinal purposes. And I'm going to be kind of glancing at my notes quite a bit. These are notes from a sermon that I actually preached years ago, but they're good notes. So I'm going to be following along, because I'm going to do this in about half the time that I did that sermon, but it helps to look at the notes because there's a significant amount of information to cover. So it's actually a plant. The wormwood plant has a unique side effect. It turns the tongue black, and the Russian word for black is cherny. So that's where we get this word Chernobyl. Now, here's what's interesting. If you are reading a Russian Bible, a Bible written in the language of Russian language, the verse that we just read, chapter 8, verse 8, would say this, or I'm sorry, chapter 8, verse 11, would say this. The name of the star is Chernobyl. So instead of saying the name of the star is Wormwood, it would say the name of the star is Chernobyl. So that's very significant, because you may recognize that name, Chernobyl. You should, at least, if you have any knowledge of history at all. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986, April 26, 1986, was the greatest nuclear disaster of history. And I want to share some of that disaster and the details of it to show you just how closely it fits with these two verses in the prophecy. Okay. So Chernobyl is a nuclear plant. It's not actively working today, but it's a nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. Okay. Now, on April 26, 1986, there were two explosions at the Chernobyl disaster. I'm not going to go into all the details of how those explosions happened, because I don't have time. It's not that significant. But there were two explosions. In those two explosions, 10 times the radiation of Hiroshima, imagine that, 10 times was released into the air. Okay, the first explosion knocked a 1,000-pound concrete cap off of the top of the reactor. Okay, that's how powerful it was. The second explosion shot a nuclear fire 1 mile into the air. Now let's just go back to verse 10 here of John's Revelation. It says, a star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. Think about how that must look in a vision to John, this 1 mile blazing nuclear fire. How would he describe that? Now let's go forward. The updrafts and the high altitude winds carried the nuclear fallout into Sweden, into Finland, into Europe, into Russia, and beyond. Okay, so this fallout is covering quite a distance. Now, I'm going to get just a little bit technical to you because I want to explain how this happens. It explains this passage that we just read. Cesium-137 is a radioisotope. It's a very unstable chemical, okay? And its radioactivity is measured by the number of atoms disintegrating per unit of time. Now, after this explosion at Chernobyl, it rained for 4 to 5 days straight. And this cesium-137, this very unstable nuclear chemical, adhered to the raindrops and brought the nuclear waste back down to the ground. And it created these radioactive hotspots, and it got into the food sources, and it got into the water sources, and even the underground water table. Now let's go back again to the verses. It says, it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. Very, very important. Now, underground water table is what feeds springs, okay? Now, the lakes and the rivers became contaminated. Rivers throughout Europe carried the radioactive water all the way to the Black Sea. Now, I don't know if you know anything about geography, but look at it on a map. This nuclear disaster happened in the Ukraine, and it affected all of this area from just the winds carrying it. Then it fell, got into the water sources, got into the lakes and rivers, the rivers carried it all the way to Turkey, essentially, okay? Asia Minor, if you will. The Black Sea tested 40 times the levels of regular clean water, and the fish were contaminated. Now, just to give you an idea of the caliber of devastation we're talking about, Chernobyl had 4 nuclear reactors, okay? Number 4 is the one that blew. All of its turbines were completely destroyed. The generators obviously never ran again. But the removal of the uncontaminated equipment in reactor number 1, not even the one that blew, is begun, but it's not estimated to be completed until 2020 or 2022, that area. That's how devastating that this is, and the effects. Remember, this explosion happened in 1986. The remains of reactor 4, the one that blew, will remain radioactive for 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Imagine that. The fallout contaminated the fish, the goats, the deer, the mutton. Hundreds of thousands of animals were completely destroyed. When cesium-137, this unstable chemical, is ingested, it attacks the bone marrow and the thyroid, and people get bone marrow cancer and thyroid cancer. Now, of the time of my studies, this was a few years back, over 125,000 people have died directly from just the fallout in this ingestion of this cesium-127, with an estimated 2 million people affected. They're still alive, but they're either suffering cancer or they're affected by this. So I ask you this, is it so outrageous, my friends, that this caliber of an event that will have its effect for up to 1,000 years or so, is it such a stretch to believe that this would be referenced in the end time prophecies as given to John from Jesus? I think not. I think it's very significant. And when we read the passage and we think about what took place, again, let me read it to you. The third angel blew his trumpet, and the great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood, or Chernobyl. The third of the waters became Chernobyl. They became bitter. okay? And many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Well, that, my friends, is exactly what happened at Chernobyl. It was a major, life-changing, world-changing event. So I submit to you today that the third trumpet in April of 1986 was the Chernobyl nuclear accident, okay? This nuclear disaster. We are going to look at the other four trumpets and their specific clues as they have covered major world events. And I'm sure that, like me, you will agree when we get through them that these definitely are what these trumpets represented. I will stop it there for now. We actually got through that quicker than I thought. I kind of rushed through it, but you can always go back and watch the video. I encourage you, don't take my word for this. Go to the encyclopedias, Wikipedia, wherever you want to research, look this stuff up and find out just how significant this was. And then read those two verses with that information, and see if that doesn't give you some insight to this. This is Darnell coming to you from the beautiful Bedrock Ministry studio. Now let's go change the day.